Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Robert. And yes, you're right. It is, in retrospect, very sensible to be in a position of being retired. Well, semi-retired, I'd have to say. I have got one or two things on the go. I might say that my retirement wasn't exactly one that I eagerly embraced and thoroughly enjoyed, but that's politics. And certainly it's been very liberating, I've found, to be able to spend quite a bit of time delving into the history of things that we ought to know a lot more about. And indeed, anybody, I think, going out of public life inevitably reflects that if only you knew this, that or the other thing, then such and such a decision might well have taken a different course. A knowledge of history, I think, is an essential, not just to an educated person in our society, but to anyone who seeks to do things in society. Well, enough of the homily. Let's go back to the 1890s, and I will, in the course of this talk, give put some slides and a few overheads up. I hope the light's not too bright, and that you can pick out the various things that I want to show you. Now, we're approaching, of course, as we know, the centenary of the establishment of our nation, and as happens not just in the last decade of any century, indeed the last decade of a millennium, one would expect it to be happening even more. There are a lot of fundamental questions and a fundamental examination being made of a lot of the things we do, the way we're governed, the structure of our government, and that's very good. But after nearly 100 years of experience, there are some who believe that the most important question is not whether we become a republic or make some of these other mechanistic changes, but in fact, how can we make our federal system of government work better? What changes should be made to improve the efficiency and the way in which government interacts in this Federation of Australia? Now, the answer to that requires an understanding of how the nation was created, and that's just what I'm going to talk about now, from an unashamedly South Australian perspective. I'll examine whether federation, or indeed any union, was inevitable, why the first attempt to enact a constitution failed, whether there were viable alternatives to that constitution we eventually adopted. I'll argue that South Australia's attitude and actions were of central importance to the process which led to federation and to the shape of that federation, which is the Commonwealth of Australia today. In so doing, I'll look at three factors: the unity and commitment to the cause of federation among all the opinion makers and leaders of the province of South Australia, the strength and ability of the South Australian delegation at the 1897-98 convention sessions that drafted the constitutions, and finally, the energy and commitment displayed by the Premier of South Australia for most of this period, Charles Cameron Kingston. Well, let's begin with the creation of a nation, and whether indeed federation was logical. The federal system certainly is well fitted to balance localism and centralism, to balance national and regional interests, to bind diverse economic and social entities which are distant from each other in a nation. In the 1890s, I guess the chief examples of that system of government were the United States, the great democratic republic, federated republic, Canada, and the cantons of Switzerland. For many, both now and then, the geography, the history, the population, the different levels of social and economic development of the various colonies on the Australian mainland and the islands to the south and the east, Tasmania and New Zealand, were very analogous to the structure of those federated nations. So it's not surprising, if you look at it from that perspective, that the Australian Constitution is federal. It was drafted with the powers of the central government spelt out. One of the Houses of Parliament was in place to protect the rights of the states. There was an independent Supreme Court to interpret and ensure the intention of the framers was enacted, and there was a very difficult amendment procedure to ensure that it wasn't altered on a whim or for reasons of passing fashion or enthusiasm, or indeed by manipulation. Now that all seems logical and inevitable. In practice, over this century, the reality's been a bit different. The balance of power, for instance, has shifted from the states to the centre to a far greater extent than was ever contemplated. The High Court has had a profound effect on the balance of central and state powers beyond what could be seen as mere interpretation, and the Senate has acted as a partisan rather than a states' house. Nevertheless, we're not surprised, and in fact I think we take for granted, that the Commonwealth retains its basic shape. It's still united, The Constitution itself remains virtually intact and has resisted significant amendment. But that analysis undersells the achievement of those who founded the nation. And let's turn to that. I would argue that federation was neither logical, inevitable, nor indeed necessary in the 1890s. With hindsight, we could regard the arguments in favour of creating a nation as self-evident. They led inexorably to its creation from the disparate colonies. But this ignores the fact that every argument in favour could be met by an equally strong counterforce, which suggested quite different outcomes were possible and even desirable. And to illustrate that, I'll put up this chart. Except somebody's removed my car. Here we go. It's on. The following table sets out 9 arguments and the possible factors for federation and possible factors against. Let's take them one by one. Firstly, governance, the system of government. It's a good idea to have a uniform voting system and voting rights. But on the other hand, there were those colonies who were not so progressive as some. For instance, South Australia was the only colony with votes for women. There were a fierce argument about property qualifications in upper houses, and the attitude to that differed from colony to colony. So in a sense, arguments in each of the colonies around these factors worked against rather than in favour of unity. Let's look at one of the big arguments, the ease of intercolonial trade, the abolition of the customs, barriers and duties. Well, that's certainly a desirable thing. But on the other hand, most of the colonies' treasuries were reliable on those very duties that people were talking about abolishing. There was the free trade versus protection argument, notably New South Wales and Victoria. There was the concept of imperial free trade and where that might fit into the overall scheme. Again, not an open and cut issue. Thirdly, financial stability, loan raisings, better that a united nation approaches the markets than all the individual colonies. But what about those colonies that felt they were rich and prosperous enough to do better than a nation and didn't want to be dragging along those who mightn't be as creditworthy or as prosperous? The question of defence, a unified defence system. Again, a very strong impetus to uniting the nation. But on the other hand, would that mean that the British Imperial Navy would feel less inclined to be stationed in Australia? Would it reduce the mother country's feelings of obligation? Where would you put these defences? South Australia would want the Northern Territory well protected, Western Australia over on their coast, and lots of arguments were taking place, of course, in the 90s on those very questions. And finally, of course, the bottom line, who was going to pay? And then the question of immigration. White Australia, one of the great philosophies even developed in that period. But again, not something that unified the nation necessarily. Queensland felt the need for indentured labour. In discussing the development of the Northern Territory, an incubus on South Australia, the concept of importing Indian labourers and others seemed to conflict with that policy. Transport, unifying the nation's railways and waterways. Yes, perhaps, but then there were freights to be thought about. There were gauge differences that were going to be very costly to correct. There were cross-border attractions that could be levied by the various colonies to make sure produce went through their ports rather than somebody else's. And in the River Murray, of course, the big question was whether the New South Wales irrigators were going to take all the water to prevent, particularly the South Australian navigators, from actually using the Murray as a cargo conduit. Communications, also something that should be formalised and regularised, but equally fees, cables and their location were sources of disagreement. Number 8, the legal uniformities, so that the law applied equally to all citizens of the various colonies. Another splendid aim, but what if, for instance, one colony wanted to have what it felt was more progressive legislation, industrial laws and things of that nature? That argument is with us still today. And finally, the basic questions, the rabbit plagues, the cattle diseases, the phylloxera, the quarantine regulations. Artificial borders were preventing proper control. Yes, some would argue, and others would say no, they're keeping these evils from our door, and we don't. And Federation may indeed actually import them into our area. So, not a simple argument. Well, all of this seemed a fairly academic question, I must say, and no table like that would have appeared at the time of the convention of 1891. April 1891, the National Australasian Convention concluded its meeting in Sydney, and the delegates prepared to return to their various parliaments. They were all incidentally nominated by the parliaments of the colonies, not elected by general vote. And the concept was to take the enabling bill and to give it effect in the various colonies. Here on this first slide are the delegates who've assembled for this particular gathering, and I'll just try and point out a few. You can't overlook, of course, the massive figure of Sir Henry Parkes sitting there in the centre. This was his particular creation, and the moment, of course, Parkes ceased to be a central figure, which was very soon after this conference. He seemed to spend most of his time trying to destroy the initiatives, but nonetheless, this was his high point, if you like, as a unifier of the nation. But I'd just like to pick out a few of the South Australian delegates. There were 7 of them in all. You see in the back there the rather massive form of Tom Playford, old Thomas Playford. You can see here Charles Cameron Kingston, turning as is often the case to the profile that he feels best suits his splendid nose and aquiline features. There's nothing over there that he's looking at. Further along you see Sir John Downer, clean-shaven, like Edmund Barton, one of the few of that time who eschewed the fashion of beard and moustache, although very conservative in his politics. Down here, sitting on the grass, you see Coburn. Next to him there's Gordon, and somewhere, I think that's, yes, here we are. There's Bray, who was the Chief Secretary at the time, sitting next to Baker, who was the member of the Legislative Council and one of the great constitutional experts of the time. He'd actually published a monograph which was very influential. So there's an interesting group. I'd just point out Edmund Barton and Alfred Deakin. And it's very interesting that in 1891, 10 years before the Constitution, 9 before the arguments in London of 1900, the 3 key people, Barton, Deakin and Kingston, are there, separated only by 1 in that particular photo. Well, the 1891 convention, in fact, didn't yield the results that was expected. There were difficulties in the legislatures, there were changes of government, parliamentary personnel changed, all against the background of the Great Depression of the early 1890s, which rolled through Australia, creating economic and social havoc. Victoria, incidentally, was the greatest sufferer. It was the prime mover in the Federation cause. Little wonder, then, that despite the optimism of the delegates, the process stalled at this point. Now, here I come to the question, were there alternatives? Well, yes, there were, and let's look at them. All these are possibilities that were actively canvassed at the time. To begin, it would have been possible to have a union of the mainland Australian continent, one which left Tasmania out. Contemplated perhaps because Tasmania as an island nation, or island colony rather, saw its interests very much as being in common with New Zealand, a maritime province. And from time to time at the various premiers' conferences and other intercolonial gatherings, they worked together. A union between them and a union between mainland Australia separately was on the cards. There was a possibility of a union going ahead without Queensland. Remember, Queensland did not participate in the 1897-98 Constitution. Its Parliament could not agree to pass the bill. And Queensland was racked by tension in this time between on an issue which recurs to this day, that is whether the state should be split into a North Queensland, a Central Queensland and a Southern Queensland. And again, they couldn't agree on how the delegates could be elected and where Queensland would fit under a federation. Would have been quite possible to have, and indeed we almost did, a union without Western Australia. Western Australia was dragged, or its government anyway, very reluctant into the federation, which I'll mention a bit later. It was remote from the other colonies, but it had only just achieved responsible government. It was feeling its strength for the first time, and most importantly had the prospect of the great riches of the Western goldfields. It wasn't enthusiastic at all. A union between Victoria and New South Wales only. Now this can't be discounted, because in 1894 this was a very real possibility. Both the government of New South Wales, headed by George Dibbs, and his counterpart in Victoria, the government of Patterson, were actively considering a very detailed proposal of union which Dibbs had produced. The logic of the efficiencies and arrangements that it proposed is very strong indeed. And Dibbs' concept was that Victoria and New South Wales would get together, and then the other colonies would be forced to come into some sort of union on their terms. They wouldn't have to negotiate about the rights of small states or federalism or anything of that sort. A unification was the way to go. And it so happened that George Reid was successful in the election just following Dibbs' promulgation of this proposal, and George Turner in Victoria very soon after unseated Patterson. If those two governments had continued on and continued their talks, who knows what the shape might have been. Throughout this period there was the Federal Council of Australasia, a body established by statute of the Imperial Parliament. It had in fact a law-making ability itself, providing the various states that were members of it agreed. Why had it not succeeded? Largely because New South Wales had refused to join. Sir Henry Parkes had proposed just such a council with those powers in the 1870s and early 80s, but when it was actually established he was not in office and couldn't get the credit for it, so he proceeded to denounce it. And New South Wales never joined. South Australia did join, but only temporarily. The Legislative Council could not be induced to make us permanent members, and despite frequent attempts, 2 or 3 in the early 90s by successive administrations, South Australia stayed out. New Zealand had not joined, and it meant that the core of the council, Victoria, Queensland, Tasmania and Western Australia, continued to meet, and interestingly enough Fiji, the colony, had been included as well. But it did form the basis of a viable union of some sort. A simple confederation where you agree on certain things, customs, post and telegraphs, defence. A series of bilateral intercolonial agreements, and Premier Kingston caused great umbrage among his colleagues with just such a one with New Zealand, which I'll come to in 1895. And of course finally no change at all, because it's a fact that through the period that federation and unification was being discussed, there were constant meetings of ministers and premiers and regularisation of various issues, and they were being done quite constructively and, oddly enough, quite amicably. Well, there are the alternatives. Federation, however, was revived in 1891. It was accomplished after 1891. It was accomplished by 1901. The process was one which included pressure group activity, the popular movement for federation, the various leagues and associations like the Australian Natives Association and the Federation League. It involved government and parliamentary leadership, and most interestingly and importantly, it involved democratic participation in the ultimate decisions of a kind no previous constitution in the world had enjoyed. Ours was voted in by the people themselves, generally. The form, of course, was federal. Now, how and why did this occur? And in examining this, I'm suggesting South Australia becomes of crucial importance. The 3 elements I've identified in support of this thesis are, firstly, the unity and commitment to the cause of federation demonstrated by our community leaders, the strength and influence of our delegation, I'm just reminding you of what I said earlier, and indeed its voting behaviour, which was critical to ensuring workable compromises, and the role of Kingston himself. Of particular note, I think, is his role in the summer of 1894-5 in restarting the process as president of the 1897-8 conventions, as a member of the Premier's group that compromised and ensured the second referendum could bring New South Wales in, and finally in London, representing Australia's interests against those of the Empire in 1900. Well, now, let's deal with each of those in turn. Firstly, the commitment to the cause in South Australia. I'd suggest that there were a number of forces working for federation in this state. Firstly, our central location. We were strategically placed. The communication with the rest of the world, largely due to the brilliant efforts of Sir Charles Todd and others, came down through the central spine into Adelaide and was then sent to the rest of Australia. While some manufacturers or processors, such as tanners and furniture makers, were concerned about possible swamping from Victoria, there was a fairly universal appreciation that South Australian goods and services could only benefit from free access to other colonial markets. Much of the argument is still relevant, that the local market was not large enough to support the expansion and the prosperity of the colony without substantial trade. We've heard it before and we're hearing it today. One product, of course, which was stood out, particularly after the destruction of the eastern state vineyards by phylloxera around about this time, was the wine industry. Despite the huge opportunities it provided to South Australia at this time, they were finding it very hard to break into markets because of the prohibitive tariffs. The whole impetus of Kingston's deal with New Zealand on bilateral tariffs was driven by wine and wine producers in South Australia. As you would expect, the South East was a very strong force in favour of federation. They wanted access to Victorian markets and much freer trade between them. They wanted to get rid of the customs barriers, and in the case of Mount Gambier, they even believed they could be the site of the national capital. The River Murray, again critical as the end user of the Murray, whose upper waters flow through other states. The colony saw the advantage of a national interest overriding those of the eastern colonies. The only means, it was felt, of safeguarding navigation on the Murray against the interest of irrigators, and indeed also supporting our own irrigation districts by an assured flow of water. Some of the longest, most protracted and indeed erudite debates of the conventions took place on this very issue. Then there was Broken Hill. A quirk of fate meant that this fabulously rich city or mining lode was just over the border. In all respects, it was a South Australian city. Its product was processed in South Australia. Its economic value to us was enormous, although we didn't get any of the royalties. Without federation, the New South Wales government could well build a railway and seek to divert all that activity away from South Australia. In both the referendums on federation, South Australians were very active and successful in campaigning and providing financial support to pro-federation candidates in Broken Hill, and thus affecting the New South Wales result. I've mentioned the riches of the West, which the early 90s were revealing. They were great opportunities for South Australia, for our machinery and trading businesses, shipping produce and services to the mines and new towns through the port of Esperance largely. The miners were mostly from the eastern states, many of them from South Australia. They were strongly in favour of federation because they didn't like the way in which the Western Australian government was dealing or not dealing with them. Their leader, John Kirwan, had been the editor of the Port Augusta paper before going to Kalgoorlie. He had a number of good contacts with leading South Australians, including Kingston, whom he had supported. By 1898, Forrest and his government were opposed to the draft constitution and any kind of union, and they were showing no sign of even consulting the people on the matter. Kirwan planned a campaign on the goldfields which received great assistance and advice from Kingston, from Glynn and Simon. There was tension between the governments of South Australia and Western Australia, in fact, because Forrest accused them of supporting a separation movement on the goldfields. Kirwan, in fact, did develop a separation for federation movement, collected 20 to 30,000 signatures in support of separation, which he sent to London at a very timely moment. It had the effect of the imperial government in 1900 putting great pressure on Forrest, not necessarily to join, but to have the plebiscite, the referendum that he was refusing to have. The huge majority for federation on the goldfields, which converted what would have been a bare majority into the biggest margin for federation apart from Victoria and South Australia, owed a lot to people in this state. And finally, the list is not exhaustive, but here's another one, the Northern Territory. It had been, South Australia had been administering the territory since 1863. It had reached the conclusion that it could not, in fact, ever see the territory develop or yield any kind of prosperity or wealth to the province overall. The loss was estimated at something like £70,000 per annum to sustain the activity that was going on there. The concept of just leasing the territory out to foreign entrepreneurs was antithetical to the politicians who felt that this would be an invitation for massive indentured labour or other measures to be taken. And the best way of handling this problem was to get it off South Australia's plate and into the hands of a federal government. Interestingly enough, the Territorian settlers themselves agreed because they felt the South Australians were doing nothing for them. Well, although the expectations for federation varied, as that list suggested, there was a near unanimity of the political leadership. Conservatives such as Baker, Simon, Downer were united with their sworn enemies, people like Kingston, Holder and Coburn. With the emerging Labor Party being a bit equivocal, there was nonetheless a unity across the factions and in the press that gave great authority to the movement. The Australian Natives Association, the Federal League, generated lots of enthusiasm. Many functions, meetings, events were held. It's not surprising that the South Australian electorate, including women then enfranchised only in this province, gave overwhelming endorsement to the referendums on both occasions. Ironically, only 2 electorates rejected the bill, and one of them was West Adelaide, the seat of the Premier, the champion of federation, although this didn't really affect his personal following in the district at either provincial or later federal level. Indeed, at the federal level he was returned unopposed on 2 occasions. Well, now let me turn to the South Australian delegation at the 1897-8 convention. They played a critical role because of their ability to act as a power broker between the biggest 2 and the smallest 2 colonies, and through the sheer quality of their delegates. There have been a number of pieces of work done on this. Robert R.L. Reid made a specific study of the contribution to federation made by South Australia delegates at the conventions of 91 and 97-98 in the 50s. Peter Howell has done a small monograph drawing on those sources and adding some scholarship to it as well. Alfred Deakin, let's go back to contemporaries. Alfred Deakin observed that, and I quote, "measured on all-round ability, the South Australian delegation was undoubtedly the strongest." Bernard Wise, the New South Wales delegate, said, "The first feature of the convention was the immense superiority of the South Australian delegation over that from any other colony." They were very worthy representatives indeed. As R.L. Reid has put it, the impression from the debates, the convention debates, is one of the South Australians bubbling over with ideas. At some stage, every one of them made a contribution and proposed new ideas for the convention's consideration. There were no silent members from South Australia, as there were from WA, Tasmania and New South Wales. And of course, as well as on the debates on the floor, they were all prominent in committees. We'll now have the slide which shows us the delegates of 1891. This, sorry, no, I should. Where's it gone? Here. 1891, the delegates are assembled, and you could probably recognise that it's actually where the coffee lounge is at the back of Parliament House, with Old Parliament House in the background. There was a connecting walkway between the first floor of Old Parliament House and the House of what is now the House of Assembly side of the Parliament, and it's in front of that the delegates are sitting. Let me, yes, this is 1891. I just wanted to make the point that of the delegates from South Australia, 5 of them actually had been among the 7 at that 1891 conference. The 2 exceptions were Bray, who had died. He'd become Agent General for South Australia, and in 1894 he resigned because of ill health, and in fact on his way back he eventually died in Colombo, in Ceylon. He was replaced by another 1891 delegate, the then Chief Secretary, Treasurer in the Kingston government, Thomas Playford. So Playford was in London at that time as our Agent General. So neither of those two delegates were available. All the other 5 were re-elected by the people, and in fact that gave them an experience which was superior to any other delegation appearing at that conference. Now, I'll just move to the next. I'll do a couple more slides here at this point. This is the Kingston Ministry of 1893. I put this up because, again, you can see a government that's committed to the cause of federation. Seated there are the 6 ministers, of whom Playford and Kingston and Cockburn and Gordon, 4 of them we've seen, Cockburn, that's Holder. The 4 there were all at that 1891 convention, convinced federationists, and of them 3 were at the 97-98 convention. Holder was not at the 91 convention, but he did join his colleagues in 97-98. So there is a formidable ministerial team. The other minister is Peter Gillen, and just for the sake of completeness, when Playford left and Gordon resigned over the hospital dispute, quite unconnected to his attitude to the government, there were some changes made. But again, you can see the core of the 3, Kingston, Cockburn and Holder. That's Jenkins, who later became Premier. It's O'Loughlin and Gillen. And that was taken in 1896, and this was taken a few months later. Gillen died in office very unexpectedly. He was replaced by L. O'Loughlin, that's J.V. O'Loughlin, and the ministry carried through. But there was a considerable stability in that ministry, and most importantly, a commitment to federation. These were the powerful group that were elected, the 10. As it happens, this is a cartoon from Quiz magazine, which was opposed or very sceptical of federation. Its scepticism can be seen from the state of the Commonwealth Bridge on which the gentlemen stand. I'll come back to that in a minute. But there are our delegates. You've got Kingston standing at the front. His identity with federation and his involvement was simply unparalleled. Behind him stands Holder and then Gordon. There is Howe. There is Solomon. There is Simon, one of the leading lawyers, and one of only 2, because Glynn was the other, who are not currently in the Parliament, although both of them had been in the Parliament, and both of them went into Parliament again later. Downer, smoking his inevitable cigar, he's nearly always pictured in that way, and Baker, the President of the Legislative Council. In a sense, they are in their political order, or as the cartoonists would see it, because here's the prop of liberalism at this end of the Commonwealth Bridge, and there's conservatism and Toryism, all of them collapsing under the strain, and one goes with the Liberals across into the more conservative ranks. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Of that team, the notable feature, of course, is that they are either Liberals, Conservatives or Tories. There were no Labor members elected. The Labor candidates failed. In fact, of the 10 to be elected, Labor came 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th and 15th. So they missed out. Interestingly enough, the only woman in Australia standing, and indeed entitled to stand, Catherine Helen Spence, also did not achieve election. She got some 7,000 or so votes, but she came around 20 or so of the 30-odd delegates. One reason being that she'd refused a place on anybody's ticket. She wanted to stand independently. One reason perhaps the Labor candidates missed out is that they were on a ministerial ticket, which caused some resentment. At the whole convention, there was only one Labor member, Trenwith from Victoria, and it perhaps accounts at times for Labor's equivocal attitude to federation in those early years. Now, despite the extraordinary domestic, political and personal hostility between the South Australian delegates that I've referred to a moment ago, somehow or other, even though they had differences on issues at the convention, they managed to work together as a team when it mattered. As Chris puts it, when particularly critical interests to South Australia, such as the control of rail freight rates or river water usage, were at stake, they were frequently and animatedly caucused between the cities and to some purpose. This is a cartoon that demonstrates this very point. Again from Quiz. This is the 19th of May, 1898. It's after the convention, and its title is Strange Bedfellows, and indeed they are. Kingston's awaking on the morning after. He's finding himself in bed with his two most venal enemies in state politics, Baker and Simon. They're lying under Federation sheets, as you can see, and out of the picture above their head actually is a plaque with a motto saying, "God bless our federated home." So it's quite clear what's brought them together in this unholy alliance. What's interesting is the accoutrements they brought into the bedroom with them. The box, under the bed is Simon's Gladstone bag containing his speeches of abuse of Kingston, for which he's not charging a retainer. No retainer, it says there. The invective that flew between these two is just incredible to read. Next to it there is the box of dueling pistols belonging to R.C. Baker, supposedly. It says, not to be used. This was the occasion, one might recall, when Kingston challenged Baker to a duel and appeared with his pistols in Victoria Square at the appointed hour and was promptly arrested and charged for this illegal act. He was still, in fact, bound over to keep the peace when he became Premier in June 1893. Indeed, the point was taken against him and whether or not he could serve. Kingston's rifle is, in fact, sticking out from the side of the bed there, labelled Democracy, but obviously not in use at the moment. So strange bedfellows they might have been, but they were certainly very effective in the Federation cause. I'd like to just now come back to the picture of the delegates in Adelaide at the convention. Oddly enough, perhaps it was somebody's idea of a joke, Kingston, who's quite a big man and was the president of the convention, is seated there in the middle on a special low chair behind a tree. It's suggested that Baker, who's sitting there, contrived this because he was very cross that Kingston had been elected president rather than him. Kingston became president, but that allowed him, of course, to speak in committees and attend various committee meetings. Baker, as chairman of the committees, and indeed one of the most informed on these issues, was virtually silenced by having to act as the chair. Now, seated next to Kingston are the premiers: George Reid of New South Wales, Braddon of Tasmania, Turner of Victoria, and Forrest of Western Australia. Have chosen the sort of places of honour at the front of the delegation. But within the group, we find the various South Australian delegates I've mentioned. There's Solomon with his very prominent beard. Moving along that row, we find Coburn. Moving further across, we find Downer standing in the corner, clean-shaven, next to Gordon. Even though their politics were very different, they could work together in this environment. We can see Barton, the leader of the convention, standing next to Alfred Deakin. They always seem to juxtapose in the pictures, and not very far from Kingston, that trio again. And various others of the delegates. I've mentioned Kingston and played his role, particularly in 1891. Holder, though, was in fact not an insignificant participant in this convention by any means. He was regarded, in fact, as one of the best treasurers and finance men in Australia, in the broader Australia, and indeed was responsible for the drafting and the arguing through of most of the major financial clauses in that chapter of the Federal Constitution. He and Turner, the Victorian Premier, worked on that. But interestingly also, it was he that ensured the franchise did not exclude anyone who had a right to exercise a vote at state level. This was particularly significant for women in South Australia and indeed for Aborigines in South Australia. Because of entitlements they had to vote in this state, they were able to exercise those votes at the federal elections, and it would not have been the case if in fact the restrictive clauses that were being argued at the time were prevailed. Coburn is, as already mentioned, the franchise was also something on which he was a very strong advocate, but though radical in his views, he was very strong on state rights as well. Baker, the chairman of committees, I've already acknowledged his enormous influence as a theorist and philosopher of principles of federation, and he played a major role as chairman on the various committees, although restricted in the debates because he had to sit in the chair for for much of the time. Gordon can be credited with the Interstate Commission, which, according to Peter Howell, was effectively emasculated in one of the High Court's sillier and more regrettable decisions. Simon, who we've come across, headed the Judiciary Committee. He was responsible for the provisions such as those restricting appeals to the Privy Council, and with Glynn and Gordon successfully headed the case on behalf of South Australia on the water issue. Downer, we've seen him characterised on instead of him, but he was a very eminent lawyer, and he, Barton, and O'Connor worked at Downer House, which is now part of St Mark's College, where Barton was staying, and this is where the legend that parts of the Commonwealth Constitution were in fact drafted over the table of Downer House comes from. So Downer certainly made a major contribution there. As well as Glynn is another delegate, was a leader in the water issue, as I've already said, and as well as he joined Kingston on the critical Senate vote. Howe, another of the delegates, a rank and file you'd think, but his sheer persistence in arguing through 3 convention sessions was able to insert the clause giving the Commonwealth power to deal with invalid and aged pensions and the social security measures that flow from that. Solomon contributed in areas such as the deadlock provisions and alteration of the Constitution and, of course, the future of the Territory, because he was the member for the Northern Territory. So all of the South Australians made significant contributions, significant speeches. The clerk of the convention also was a South Australian, E.G. Blackmore. He subsequently became clerk of the Senate. So South Australia had a preeminent reputation as draftsmen and procedural experts. Again from quiz, this is the end of these convention proceedings, and they are bringing home federation, as the caption has it. You see a rather sceptical South Australia standing at the side, looking somewhat accusingly at the pallbearers of the coffin, which is marked federation. The bearers we can see are, of course, Simon. Kingston, decked out now in his finery. He'd been to London for the Jubilee of Queen Victoria, and though refusing a knighthood, most of his colleagues accepted them, he did accept the office of the Privy Council, which had a particular uniform, and he was much lampooned by his democratic colleagues for this, having his honour. You notice the PC prominently on his lapel. And unfortunately for Kingston, his statue in Victoria Square has him wearing exactly those robes of the Privy Council. I think he would have been aghast to know it had been carried on, but there again, he did have some vanity. Baker follows, of course, and Holder and Downer, and there's Howe, and the others, we presume, are on the other side of the coffin, out of view. South Australia is saying, good gracious, gentlemen, I hope you've nothing in there. And Undertaker Kingston says, not yet, madam, but we thought it just as well to have the box ready. You never can tell what's going to happen nowadays. The delegates returning, perhaps in triumph, from the Sydney session of the conference. There was one to go. Well, the final part of this trilogy is, of course, Charles Cameron Kingston. You'll notice the profile. He's obviously very keen on this. But for all his vanities and bombast and the other means by which he's criticised, there's no question that from 1888, when he represented Australia with Thomas Playford at the first intercolonial conference in Sydney, until 1900, when he was a member of the so-called Inner Circle of Three with Barton and Deakin, arguing the case of the British government, he took a prominent and often leading role at all the significant meetings. The only one that he wasn't present at was the 1890 meeting in Melbourne. Every other he attended, a record unequalled by any participant from any colony. As Chris puts it, he sustained his role in a long sequence of consultations, correspondence, fortuitous or contrived gatherings, debates, draftings and redraftings of proposals, constitutional documents. He campaigned on the hustings and steered measures through Parliament. Now, among these great contributions was his campaign to revive federation in the period after the 1891 convention had simply stalled and the Depression had stopped all major federation or unifying activity. In August 1894, on Reed's election, he wrote to Reed, he got him G'd up, he insisted on getting responses from him and his fellow premiers, and the exchange of letters and cables is very interesting indeed to examine. And there's no question that without Kingston acting as some kind of goad, but at the same time having the common sense to understand that he could not take the lead, that in fact all depended on New South Wales, that unless Reid was prepared to take the initiative and unless New South Wales was there, federation would fail. Kingston understood that constantly throughout and was prepared at times, and it must have been very hard for him with his ego, to step back in order to try and prompt and keep George Reid up front. And it had a very significant effect. The most important effect was inducing and encouraging Reid to call a Premier's Conference in Hobart in January of 1895. I would regard this in many ways because it produced an acceptable and practical proposal for the advancement of federation, because it got the political leaders locked in. It was really the great turning point of this process. Without it, the convention we've just been looking at wouldn't have happened. It so happened that the Federal Council of Australasia was meeting in Hobart at that time. Hobart, in fact, was a very popular destination for all sorts of intercolonial meetings in summer in Australia. January, February saw large processions going down there in the days before air conditioning. And it so happened that the Federal Council was going to be there, and in a way, by calling the Premier's meeting there, it was being very mischievous and in fact quite challenging to the council, and indeed so it proved. It was very lively indeed. You know, it was interesting, during that summer of 1894-5, when this great turning point, I suggest, was about to happen, one of the most successful cricket tours was going on. A fierce battle for the Ashes was taking place, which was attracting vast crowds around the country. And significantly, of course, the colonies were playing together as Australia. One shouldn't underestimate these social and other forces that create an atmosphere around politics and society, which meant that when the premiers sat down in Hobart, they were in some sort of mood that suggested it was time something was done. And here was a classic demonstration of the way in which Australia could actually electrify and bind the various colonies together. So here are the premiers. Seated, sorry about the poor quality of this, it's taken from the Review of Reviews, but it's the only picture of the premiers in action. It's a small group, but enormously influential, because sitting around that table, they decided on a plan which actually made federation possible. The principles were ones that had been formulated by John Quick. They'd certainly been picked up strongly by Kingston, who did most of the drafting of the bill, which was to say, we can't rely on delegates of parliaments to come to an agreement. That was the problem of 1891. The delegates who assemble must have the sanction of the electorate, of the people generally. So we must have elected delegates, and while Parliament can comment on their work, at the end of the day, the delegates must be elected, the delegates must propose, and the people then must decide on those proposals. A referendum process, as I say, which is unequal. The US Constitution was not voted in by the people, and nor was the Canadian Constitution. It was only in Australia that in fact happened, and it happened because this group of men decided that it should do so. You see the chairman is Braddon, it's in Tasmania. Reid was asked to chair but deferred to his host in Hobart. Reid is sitting next to him, New South Wales. There is Nelson from Queensland, who signed off on these matters but then wasn't able to get the support of his parliament, to the extent that Queensland, despite, and again there's a good story of Kingston's work in this, despite attempts to get Queensland in, they eventually did not turn up to the convention but voted in the final referendum. George Turner of Victoria, Charles Kingston of South Australia, and John Forrest of Western Australia, who, and you can see it perhaps from his expression, was a very reluctant participant in this process, and when he went back home he said he'd refused to put into effect the election of delegates. And while Western Australia did appear at the convention, they appeared with a parliamentary delegation, unlike the others. For some reason this was found acceptable in the case of Western Australia, but had been found unacceptable in the case of Queensland. An important meeting, and the other thing that I'd like to draw out is not just that here is this group of premiers making this decision, but it is a stable group. Unlike the history of colonial politics up to this time, we are looking at a group of premiers who between them were in office for a longer continuous time than any of their predecessors had been. And throughout this process, from 1894 right through until 1899, with the exception of Nelson of Queensland, and it's significant that Queensland was the one who didn't make it in 97-98, this group steered their governments through the maze of the Federation debate. Without that stability, without that interpersonal relationship, it's unlikely that so much could have been achieved. And it's a very significant and, as it happens, fortuitous fact that they stayed in office so long. Well, I now, there's a very interesting story to be told. At this stage, give you a commercial. In this monograph, I deal with the period 1891 to 97, but I've got a lot of material about what happened in those in that intervening period to try and get the convention on the rails after the 1895 meeting of premiers. It was no easy task, and unfortunately I was expecting to have copies from the Federalism Research Centre here tonight, but they haven't arrived yet. I'm told they're on the way, but if anyone would like to order them, it's possible to do so at the back, and they can be posted out. I might say, as part of the lack of smooth sailing at this time, of course, we still had great tensions between the various colonies. Even Kingston and Turner had a monumental dispute over the free trade agreement that he had signed with New Zealand that I mentioned earlier. Their correspondence is really very amusing to read, and again, I haven't got time to deal with it tonight. But I'm not sure what I would have felt receiving some of these letters, which, for instance, began with kind courtesies and then proceeded into simply major abuse of each other's positions. An interesting thing about the 1895 Premiers' Conference that I mentioned is, of course, it was generally seen as a very positive and constructive thing, but not by everybody. There was one major exception, and that was Sir Henry Parkes, the self-styled father of Federation, of whom the more you look at it, the more, that image becomes a little more tattered. He launched a scathing attack on the Premiers and their enabling bill. And I'll just give you a flavour of his attack. Every sincere friend of Federation must see the mockery of the Conference of Premiers, which is only a device to block the way to union. What status has the self-constituted Conference of Premiers against the great historical convention of 1891? That's the one Sir Henry chaired himself, of course. Can the lesser overrule the greater? Can a coterie of mice claim for itself mastery over a gathering of lions? Reed, Kingston and Turner, he said, were three travelling lawyers. Reed was a babbling lunatic, having the reputation of never having read a book in his life, not even a law book. Kingston does not even comprehend the proprieties of the relations of men in high political life. The convention itself would be only a mob, because it was elected directly by the people, and so on. This diatribe continued. Reed actually was very dignified. He said more in sorrow than anger. Parkes was displaying conceited pomposity. Well, as I say, I won't go into the Turner-Kingston correspondence, which is very similar in its guise and style. I'll quickly move to the referendums. The conference has been held successfully, and as we saw, the gentlemen returning with their coffins. But I'll take you back again to walking the plank. The South Australian delegates, as you can see, they're imploring South Australia, that marvellously modest maiden, to cross the bridge with them. They're pleading with her to do so, even though the bridge is obviously of very shaky construction. Incidentally, there are only 9 delegates there. You might have picked up. The 10th missing one, of course, is Coburn, because he had been appointed at this time as Agent General in London, as successor to Thomas Playford. And though at the convention he'd left to take up his post at the time of the referendum. But these 9 were united in the cause. It's interesting, of course, to note the lawyers' wigs. There are 6 of them, a plethora of lawyers. In fact, at the convention of the 50 delegates, I think something like 32 were lawyers. I don't know what that says about the Constitution, but obviously Quiz has very firm views on that. The bridge, as I've said, is being propped up by the three props of the political forces, but Labor is missing. And on the other side of the bridge, and that's what I want to draw particular attention to at this juncture, were the fruits of federation. What are these gentlemen offering South Australia? Well, it appears here's the tree, the federal tree with its federal fruit, and it consists of salary, office, and various other perks and emoluments. The attitude to what people thought that they might be gaining from federation was the same then. Miss South Australia demurs. I don't think, she's being asked to come across, she says, I don't think so. Your bridge is cracked, and I'm afraid you'll take all the fruit before I get there. The referendums, of course, were very successful in all the states, with the exception of New South Wales. While it was carried in New South Wales, unfortunately, the legislature had required a threshold vote in favour, which was not achieved. This was regarded as a device to defeat the referendum by other means. And for his equivocal attitude to this, Reid, of course, earned his famous nickname of Yes, No, Reid. And here, the Quiz cartoonist's picture of the end result of this particular process. You can see the noble Barton standing there. He'd been holding the rope of the Federation balloon, but the evil, rotund Reid, a marvellous cartoonist subject, he actually looks like that in real life, has cut the rope by his yes-no attitude and thus betrayed the federal cause. Meanwhile, Turner's managed to get them in the balloon. And remains, of course, completely dedicated. He's taking his colleagues Braddon of Tasmania and Kingston in the balloon, the federal balloon, with him. And Barton is saying, "Hi there, you can't go up without me." Turner says, "It's all right. I'm only going to take these boys for an airing. When I've finished with them, you can have a cut in as well." And Kingston and Braddon are exclaiming, "Stop, stop, we can't get out." Of course, it's quite compelling and very accurate. Without New South Wales, federation just would not work. And while Victoria may well have been happy to drag South Australia and Victoria and Tasmania along with it, that certainly was something that both those states would have been very concerned about indeed. So the process had to be picked up and something done about it, and indeed it was. The premiers got together in 1899. Again, Kingston took a leading part in the compromises that were worked out, things that didn't matter really, although they're unfortunate, like the location of Canberra having to be in New South Wales, the federal capital, but a number of important compromises on financial matters which proved to be critical to the shape of federation, and again, I won't go into them. And I'll conclude with the final act which took place in London, where the Imperial Parliament was considering the recommendations and the measure that had been referred to it from Australia. There was great difficulties over a number of clauses which were ironed out, but the most important one and the sticking point was that involving the appeals to the Privy Council. And on this, Kingston and Simon, his arch-enemy, were absolutely at one. Sir Samuel Way, the Chief Justice of South Australia, and other Chief Justices, I might add, had quite different views and were actively lobbying against the proposal. In Way's case, it was because he actually was a member of the Privy Council at that time and felt that it was going to undermine its status. Be that as it may, they were able to come up with a compromise which has proved very workable indeed. And the Western Australian referendum followed in 1900, and so the Federation was complete. Kingston was there, not because he was no longer Premier, but because his colleagues in a government then led by Holder believed he was the most appropriate, and indeed he was seen nationally to be a representative of the province of South Australia. And with Barton and Deakin, they held the crucial meetings, they made the decisions, and they eventually brought the Constitution home. And in 1901, not only was the Commonwealth of Australia established, but Barton became its Prime Minister, and Deakin and Kingston were both members of the government. Thank you.